First and foremost, I want to thank you so much for taking out the time to stop by and talk to us about some of the amazing work that you have done over the years.
I don't know how amazing it is, but I'm happy to talk about it.
Yeah, definitely. It's an honor. For the viewers who may not recognize you, could you let them know who you are, where you're from, and definitely what do you do?
My name is Dr. Tom Champney. I'm a professor of cell biology at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine. I teach anatomy to first-year medical students and graduate students, etc. I teach anatomy, histology, neuroanatomy, embryology, a number of different courses. I also run the body donor program here in South Florida. So we run a body donor program that brings in about 100 donors a year, and we end up using a number of them here at the University of Miami, but we also distribute them to other medical schools, et cetera, in the local South Florida area. I have a very strong interest in making sure that those individuals are treated appropriately, ethically, respectfully, with dignity. And so I've been, for the probably past 10 or 15 years, have been writing about that, encouraging my colleagues to treat these individuals with the respect and dignity they deserve. And so that's probably been my main scholarly activity for, like I said, the past 15 years. Prior to that, I was at Texas A&M for many years, and I did a lot of melatonin research, the pineal gland and melatonin. And so that's been another area of my interest that I've done a lot of work in. So happy to tell you more if you'd like to know more.
Wow, definitely. I really respect what you're doing, and I'm sure it's appreciated by the viewers as well. Now, I can ask you this: when did you develop this passion for biology and anatomy? Is this something that you always wanted to do since you were young, or did you kind of get into it later?
So, yeah, that's a fun story. I've always had an interest in biology, and I've always had an interest in how the world works and how things go on. And I have come from a family of teachers, so a lot of teachers in the family as well. But specifically for anatomy, I didn't have any real interest in anatomy until I went to graduate school. And when I went to graduate school, I was going to the University of Texas Health Science Center at San Antonio to work with a specific individual, Dr. Russell Ryder, who was the best known individual working on the pineal gland, an area that I was going to do research in. And that's why I went there, was to work with him, do research on the pineal gland and melatonin. But when I got there, they said, oh, by the way, you're going to have to take all of these basic medical science classes like anatomy and physiology and histology, et cetera. And after that, you're going to have to teach those classes because we're going to pay you a stipend to be able to do that. Not, getting paid was a great thing. So I said, okay, whatever. So that was my introduction to anatomy. Is I went in there, started doing the teaching, learning it, doing the teaching, et cetera, and really did end up enjoying it. And I find it fascinating because my father was an engineer, and a lot of how the body works has an engineering component to it. How things get along with each other and how they work together, et cetera. So it was serendipitous, but it was I think it's worked out quite well. And I'll tell your viewers, et cetera, if you want to have a steady job, learn how to teach anatomy and histology. There are fewer and fewer individuals that can do that. And so that the job market is very good, right? There's more demand than there is supply. So if you can teach anatomy and teach histology, those are really good skills to have in order to have a job.
Wow. Okay. I appreciate you sharing that. Definitely. Now, I guess I could ask you this. What exactly is the pineal gland and what does it do?
So the pineal gland is located in the center of your head, kind of very deep inside the center of your head. In birds and in reptiles, it's actually a photoreceptor. It actually has little photoreceptors. It's the third eye. You might have heard people refer to that third eye, that the little clear space that reptiles have in the back. That's the pineal gland, and it can actually respond to light. So it tells your body what time of day it is, whether it's daytime or whether it's nighttime, based on the amount of light that's seen. In mammals like us, our eyes have taken over that neural activity. So there's a sequence of nerves that go from the eyes to the pineal gland that tell the pineal gland when it's daytime and when it's nighttime. That tells us not just day, night, it also tells us what time of year it is. Because remember, in summertime, you have very long days, and in wintertime, you have very short days. And so the pineal gland can kind of sense that as well, and can then release a hormone called melatonin, which can then go around the body and modify the body based on the time of year. So whether you're going to reproduce at certain times of year, or whether you're going to have put fat on, do different metabolic things, those things will change on a seasonal basis. And the pineal gland and melatonin helps to synchronize those and make sure that they're done appropriately, both for the time of day and for the time of year.
Wow. Okay. Now
And
I
you
can
might have
ask
heard,
you.
yeah,
Uh-huh.
you might have heard of melatonin. Many people take it to help them to get to sleep at night, because melatonin rises at night. And then, so your body, when it sees high levels of melatonin, basically thinks it's nighttime. So if you want to help get to sleep, some people take some melatonin and it helps them get to sleep at night. You can also use it to help to alleviate some jet lag as well. But
Yeah, I can relate to that because I'm a world traveler. I've been to almost 70 countries. I'm currently in Madagascar, but that's one of the things like I never really get used to when I fly from one country to the next country and the time is off, or I've been on the plane for 12 hours and then you wake up, they let the shades up. So that's something I definitely have interest in for sure. Let me
yep.
see.
Basically, what you want to do is you want to take some melatonin a few days before you travel. So 3 or 4 days before you travel, you take melatonin at the time of nighttime in the country you're going to. So if you're going to a country where it's 11 p.m., you figure out where 11 p.m. is in that country, and you take some melatonin at that 11 p.m. time, because you're basically then telling your body, ooh, it's 11 p.m. in whatever country I'm going to. And if you do that for a few days before you travel, by the time you get to that country, your body will be saying, oh, it's 11 p.m. I know when nighttime is, and I know it's time to go to sleep, etc. So it does help you to resynchronize yourself to that new time zone.
That's a great idea. I'm definitely going to have to try that for sure. Okay, now I wanted to ask you about this, about the role of melatonin on dopamine release. You had did some work and research in that area.
I did in some cells primarily. We did some cell cultures, and we were looking at how melatonin regulated dopamine release. That's still an area that's not well investigated, but it's thought that melatonin might have impact on some of the neural pathways within the brain, because it seems to, in essence, tell your brain you want to go to sleep, right? You want to rest, you want to depress a lot of the neural firing, et cetera. So there's thoughts that it might have impact in both the GABA system and in the dopamine system as a means to kind of regulate some of those neurotransmitters, so that you understand a little, your body can think about whether it's nighttime or daytime. But as I would say, those are relatively preliminary data. There's not a lot of strong data to support that additional research.
Okay, I appreciate you sharing that. Now I wanted to kind of fast forward a little bit and talk about some of your journal articles. Would you be able to speak on the ethical concerns surrounding artificial intelligence in anatomy education?
Sure. I was noticing about the sun in my face. You like that? It's the sun in Miami, huh? The artificial intelligence article we wrote, we really wrote it to show that there are limitations to artificial intelligence, that there are certain things that artificial intelligence will never be able to do. And the example we provided, because it's in our field, is the use of body donors in the anatomy lab. And could you substitute, a simulacrum, some sort of AI robot or something that would take the place of that anatomy donor? And our basic summation is that no, that's not replaceable, because when a student comes into the anatomy lab and sees that donor in the lab, they realize that was a living human. They realize that person had a life, right? That they had children, that they did things in their life. It lets the students think about death and dying. It lets the students to think about altruism, how that individual donated their body so that they could study and learn from them. None of these things can be duplicated with an AI program, right? Even the best robot in the world is still going to be a robot. And the students coming into the lab are going to see that and are going to say, oh, this is a robot, I'll learn from it, et cetera. But they're not going to learn all of those additional aspects that we think are very valuable for them to learn in the lab. i.e. about death and dying, about altruism, about, that these could be their first patients and to think about them as a patient, et cetera. I generally call it the human touch, right? Feeling that human connection that would normally take place. And so that was the reason we wrote the article, was to let people know that there are areas where AI will never be able to duplicate what occurs.
Okay, that's very interesting because it seems like AI is everywhere in the music. You know, they can make songs of people that are no longer here, or even with the pictures and the video, they can make people
Right.
move and perform. But that's kind of, I don't know, from my perspective, that's like a good thing to still get that hands-on experience. But I can ask you, from the students, have you seen, are most students, preferring to work with the donors, or is there a significant amount of students that really want to, use AI?
So there are some AI programs out there, and some students do use them to help them learn the material as well. But that is just going to teach them the anatomy material, right? It's not going to teach them all these other things. And so when you talk to the students about that, about are you thinking about death and dying? Are you thinking about this individual and what their life was like, right? Are you thinking about the respect that we owe these individuals for donating, et cetera? They all realize that none of that would occur with the computer programs they're using, or the digital material, or anything along that line. So I think they understand the value that takes place. The other thing I'll mention is that in our labs, we have about 20 donors that we use in the lab. And this allows the students to see that large variability that occurs in the human form. We're not all built the same. And as doctors, they're going to see patients in very different shapes and sizes, and they need to be aware of that and think about those various changes that can occur. And doing that with donors in the lab is a really great way to kind of start them along that process, to think about all the changes that are in just normal variability that normally occurs in the human form, and they can then think and think that their patients are going to be like that in the future as well. And so I think that's another valuable thing that they get that they wouldn't get with a standard AI, computer generated type of a phenomenon. But as you said, there are the example a colleague of mine likes to give is there's movies that have been made with dead actors, where they put the dead actor back in place, and digitally remaster that dead actor and put them into the movie. And nobody knows any different generally. But in the anatomy lab, you would know that. You would know that that is not a real person that you're working on. And I think that's one of the big differences.
Yeah, definitely. Now I can ask you, since you've been doing it for so many years, has there been a change in the amount of people willing to donate? Has it gone up, or is it harder now?
That's a good question. Generally, I think we have the same number of donors, and I can speak for our own program, and then I can kind of speak for the United States, and then kind of speak for the world. For our own program, we bring in about 100 donors a year, and that's been pretty steady. And I like to think that's because our program is well known. The people who know about it know that we treat these donors very, very well, with respect and dignity, and in many of the ways we handle them in the lab, et cetera. We do that in a very respectful manner. So we have what we call a lot of legacy donors. The grandparents donated, and then the parents donated, and then after the parents donating, the kids donating. And so we get a lot of these kind of legacy donations, which I also think is a good thing. It says we've obviously done something well, that families are willing to continue to donate. In the United States, there are many times that people say we have a shortage of donors. However, I tend to push back a little bit on that, because there are private body broker companies that actually get people to donate their body and then make money from that donation, which I think is inappropriate and unethical. But there are companies that do that, and those companies get lots of donors. They get lots of people coming in and donating. So I think there's probably plenty of plenty of donors available that would be willing to donate. The problem is we need to be a little more proactive and let people know about donor programs, let them know how important they are, and also how well we will treat them when they donate their bodies also. So I don't think it's as big an issue in the United States as some people tend to make it appear to be. And then in the world, there's a lot of variety. So there are some programs in Australia, in New Zealand, and other countries where they actually have an excess number of donors. And they will actually, they'll take donors until April or May of a year, and then they'll say, we have enough donors this year. I'm sorry, we can't take you anymore. And so they actually have more donors than they know what to do with. And yet there are other countries in the world which don't even have donor programs, that any of the bodies that they use, they get either from the unclaimed or from, nursing homes or places like that, where these individuals may not have consented for donation. And that can be ethically problematic, right, to use those individuals. So we would prefer that every person that's used in medical education is used from a consented standpoint, a donated standpoint. And we're trying to encourage countries around the world to develop more donor programs and to educate their colleagues and their compatriots and the populace about donor programs and how valuable they are, but also how respectful they are as well. So the hope is to move that along internationally to get more and more donors as well.
Okay. And I wanted to ask you about this article in reference to what you just said, teaching without harm procedures on the newly deceased. If you could speak about that a little bit.
Sure. That was actually a student of mine who had an interest in that, a medical student. And it's a very important point. So in some hospitals here in the United States, which treat medical students, they have a process in which once an individual dies, and they've just recently died, they'll sometimes bring medical students in and allow those medical students to practice procedures on those recently deceased individuals, practicing intubation or practicing putting in a line into one of their veins, things like that, which is valuable because those students get the opportunity to practice knowing that they're not going to hurt that individual, right? So there's a lot of value to it. The ethical problem with that is that these individuals who just died probably did not give consent to have that happen, right? So you're doing things to their body that they didn't necessarily consent for. And there's no benefit to them, right? The benefit is for the students and for people in the future, et cetera. So there needs to be some balance there. And one of the points we make in the article is that perhaps we could pre-register individuals, have them kind of pre-consent to say, if you were to die in the hospital, would it be okay for students to practice some of these techniques on you? And then you just have that in their medical record so that if they were to die in the hospital, years later or whatever, then there'd at least be some form of consent that would allow that to occur. So it's just we want to at least make people aware of that and be thinking about what takes place there.
Okay. Now, have you seen a lot of changes in terms of like maybe restrictions or policy and procedures in terms of dealing with?
Not really. I would say that many hospitals are now at least aware of it and are at least talking to their students about it, making sure that the students are okay with that, as well as maybe some family members are as well. But I have not heard of any hospitals or medical schools that have specifically established policies either for or against them. I think it's still kind of a gray area where people are doing what they think is best at the time and working through that. I will give one other example where there has been change, and that's a very good thing. It used to be in the past that when women were undergoing anesthesia for some procedure, so they'd be under general anesthesia for some procedure, physicians would allow medical students to practice pelvic exams on those women without their consent and without their knowledge because they're under anesthesia. Many people thought that was inappropriate, and that has really pretty much been banned now. No, they will not do anything on anesthetized patients without those anesthetized patients' consent. In the past, they used to think, well, the woman would never know anyway, and the students are learning from this, et cetera, so it's okay. I think that ethic has changed, and I think we're now saying, no, the patient deserves to know what is or is not going to happen to them, and therefore this should not take place, unless that woman would, of course, consent to it in some way and say, yes, it's all right. But at least now, I think in virtually all the cases I know, this is no longer being done. So there's one instance where the ethical needle has moved in the right direction.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Now I wanted to ask you about this if you could speak on it. One of the journal articles, skeletons in the closet.
Sure. That was actually a response, a letter to the editor. We wrote back. We wrote him back in based on an article called "Skeletons in the Closet." The background to that is that there are many doctors in around the world, but in the U.S. and in other countries as well, who bought human skeletal material when they were in medical school. In the 1940s and 50s and 60s, it was many times a requirement for students to buy human bones, which they would then study while they were, while they were taking their medical school classes, et cetera. And they would usually keep them with them, after they graduated and they went on, and maybe they'd use them for teaching or whatever. But a lot of times they would just sit in a box in their office or at home. And now these doctors are dying, and the families are finding these boxes of bones, human skeletal material. And that's why it's skeletons in the closet, right? They truly are skeletons being found in closets. And they have to decide what they're going to do with those human remains. Sometimes they bring them to people like me. I have human bony remains in the lab, etc. And we try to keep them with respect and dignity. We try not to abuse them, etc. Sometimes individuals will just throw those bones out, which is very sad. They were actually a human at one point in time and deserve some respect. Sometimes they'll try to sell them on eBay or something like that, which I don't think is appropriate either. So it's a major issue, and the paper basically suggested that all those bones be cremated, be destroyed, and we basically said we'd rather not see that happen. We don't know that the individuals who represent those bones would have wanted that to happen, would have wanted to be cremated. We don't really know what their wishes were. So what we would like people to do is basically just pause and hold those bones, hold them in some area where you can hold them respectfully and keep them appropriate. And then as we develop ethics, we can decide what's going to be best for them. The majority of these skeletal remains came from South Asia, came from the Indian subcontinent in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And so there's some of us that are saying maybe we should talk to those people in the Indian subcontinent and see what they think their ancestors would have liked to have done with their bones, and maybe try to get some idea about what would be the best way to deal with these skeletal material. The most respectful, the most dignified to deal with them. But we don't think that just cremating them and kind of getting rid of them, getting them out of sight is necessarily the best option. So that was kind of the response we wrote back to that article on that article. And I will say there's a lot of discussion about this ongoing in our community. What do we do with all of these human skeletal remains that we have, most of which were not taken with consent, were many times bought from marginalized people in the subcontinent. And so there's a lot of ethical concerns we have with what we do with those skeletal remains and how we work with them. And that's still an answer we don't have. We're still working on that as we go along.
Oh, okay, but that's a good idea in terms of, like you said, going to the people of that region and getting in touch with the actual cultural practice. I guess that would be
Right.
the best way to go about.
We would like to do what would be best for them, and we don't really know what's best for them. So our second best solution is to then go to the closest family relatives and say, what do you think you would have liked to have happened to them? If we don't have any close family relatives, then we go to the community, right? The community that represented them, and try to get an idea from that. So we basically have this tiered level of the individual, if not the individual, the family, and if not the family, then the local community, what we call a community of care, right? The ones that would think about those individuals and want them cared for appropriately. So I've put forward a suggestion that we develop some sort of national repository for these skeletal remains, since we don't know what they're doing and they're scattered in many places around the country. I would like to see some sort of national repository set up where we could send all these skeletal remains to, that they could be treated appropriately, kept respectfully, inventoried, etc. And then when we come to a solution, it'd be much easier to work with than to have them just, scattered around through thousands of institutions around the United States.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. So we're about 25 minutes in. I guess I got time to ask you about one more article. If you could speak on 20 years on the rationale and use of the clinical cross-sectional orientation in neuroanatomy.
Yep. So that's another area of my interest. It's one that I've been working on for 10 or 15 years now. So in the as background, in the past, when anatomists taught neuroanatomy, they taught a cross-sectional view. So you do a cross-section through the spinal cord, let's say, right? And you look at that spinal cord, and they would put it as if the person was lying on their belly. So that the bottom of the spinal cord down here was where the belly was, and the top of the spinal cord up here was where the back was, right? In that regard. All right. And that was taught for many, many, many years. Well, in the early 2000s, with the development of CT and MRI, right, those cross-sectional imaging systems, there was a new orientation that was set up, and it was flipped 180 degrees, so that now the patient is lying on their back and their belly is up at the top, right? And 20 years ago, a paper was written saying that we should switch our neuroanatomy orientation to the standard orientation that's being done in CT and MRI. So that when we teach students, they don't have to learn it one way and then, a year or two later, switch back, switch 180 degrees when they start seeing it in CT and MRI. That was a really great idea. It didn't really go very far. Nobody really did much. There was a few atlases that were kind of developed, but nothing really was done. So when I took over the neuroanatomy course here in Miami in 2009, I decided I was going to flip everything over and just start fresh from there. So I made all my own slides, I made all my own PowerPoints, etc., with that new orientation. And I only taught that CT and MRI orientation to the medical students. Therefore, they never had to switch. They started with that orientation, and then when they saw CTs and MRIs, they were in the same orientation. And because there were no resources available, I actually felt it was important to write a book. So I have a textbook called Essential Clinical Neuroanatomy that is presented in that orientation. The whole textbook, all the figures, et cetera, are presented in that clinical orientation, that CT MRI orientation. And so I wrote the book because I wanted to make sure that there was resources available for my students and other students to learn from that way. And I wrote this article to basically inform people and remind people that we should switch over. The switch is not difficult for the students because if they don't ever know, they just learn one way and go. The switch is difficult for faculty like me because we learned it for 20 years or 30 years in one direction. And you're asking them to, no, switch everything around and learn it from this other direction. And that is difficult. So the call is really to all the faculty to say, we need to get on board with the proper orientation and just use that one orientation and move through. And so I've been kind of cheerleading that, trying to move that along by writing the paper, writing the book, making sure that the students are doing well. I can tell you I've been doing it, for almost 15 years now, and our students all do well. They all know exactly the orientation they're using, and they can stay in that one orientation. But I do have colleagues of mine who've been teaching neuroanatomy for many years who are like, oh, no, I can't relearn that, And so we're trying to get that change to take place little by little. So if any of your viewers are interested, I can give them access to my book. I can show them the concepts, etc. But I think the more medical schools that switch over and make that transition, it's going to be better for the students, better for medical education, etc., etc.
Definitely, I agree. That's a great idea. That's a great idea. So yeah, I want to thank you again so much for taking out the time to stop by. It's really been a phenomenal episode. You shared a lot of great information. I'm still processing it, and I want to thank the viewers for tuning in as well.
Happy to help, and I'll tell you if anybody has any questions or would like to discuss this more, they're welcome to contact me. I'm sure they can find my email online, things like that. I'm very happy to discuss any of these concepts.
Okay, definitely. So I thank you again.